Consuming RESTful web services. Let's first talk about how we go about figuring out what we're going to use to reach out to various external systems that might be hosting a web service. Well, before we go in and call a REST endpoint or a SOAP endpoint directly, we want to check to see if there's an existing AnyPoint connector that provides connection to that service provider. If there's not, we can then use the HTTP request connector to call out to something like a RESTful web service. For the connector, we can specify host, port, and optionally a base path for the service. And on the other end, the endpoint itself, we can put the path and method. And that's what we're going to test out right now. Let's create a new flow to call a RESTful web service, use a HTTP request endpoint to consume a RESTful web service, and use DataWeave to transform the JSON response into the JSON specified by the API. So let's get started with walkthrough 7.1. Let's start off by returning to our course snippet files. We'll find the snippets inside of our student files that we have been using throughout class. So student files, and then we'll open up these snippets. Inside of snippets, let's scroll down to the module 7 section for the web services. Inside of here, let's copy the United RESTful Web Service URL that you see inside. And let's head to Postman. Now from Postman, we can paste in this URL and hit send. We should then get back a JSON response, similar to what we've been seeing throughout class with multiple flights inside. Now, let's take a look at some destination values. Inside of here, we can see SFO, LAX, we can see LAX again, CLE, a couple different destinations throughout. Now, what we're going to do in the future is use a different filtering criteria where we can specify the specific location. You'll see that in a moment. For now, let's go ahead and copy the host as we're going to need it, and let's go to AnyPoint Studio. All right, inside of AnyPoint Studio, within Source Main App, we'll return to our implementation XML. Inside of the implementation XML, let's drag an HTTP connector onto the canvas to start a new flow. Let's then double-click the name of the flow to allow us to rename it. Inside of the box where the name is specified, we'll call this flow Get United Flights Flow. All right, so with Get United Flights Flow in, let's also select our HTTP listener and get this set up. With the HTTP listener selected, let's make sure the original HTTP listener config is still selected in this dropdown. And for our path, let's go ahead and specify United. For allowed methods, we are going to allow GetRequest to come into this specific flow. Now, let's see if we can not only receive an HTTP request, but send one out. To do this, we'll drag another HTTP connector inside of our flow. Now this HTTP endpoint, of course, will act as a request element instead. So we'll start off by right-clicking and renaming in this case and giving it a quick name of United REST Request. All right. And with this element selected, let's do some basic configuration. What we'll do here is set up some properties that we can use. For example, if we go to source main resources, you'll still have your flightsdev.properties file. Inside of here, let's add in a united.host property, and let's add in what we copied to our clipboard, mu.mulesoft-training.com. All right, so now we've got some basic pieces in place. We'll save our property file up, and let's return to the global XML file inside of our project. From Global XML, we'll go to the Global Elements tab, and let's click Create. From Create, we'll go in and look for HTTP, and this time with HTTP, we want to choose the request configuration. With request configuration selected, let's configure it so that it uses our United host. And for port, we'll specify that we want it to go over port 80. Now we'll also rename this so that it's a little bit easier to understand what it does. We'll call this the United HTTP request configuration. All right, this basic config should do the job. It should be able to reach out just fine. Let's hit OK. Now that we've got that configuration in place, let's return to our implementation XML file. And with your HTTP requester selected, if you look just a little bit lower in the configuration, we can specify a path. So in this case, let's put in the same path we used in Postman, which was essentials/united/flights. And the method we used in Postman was a get. So you can drop down and choose get or type it in. And this will do a GET request based on the host we specified in that global config, adding this path onto it and making the outbound request based on that. All right, now let's be sure to add a logger at the end of our flow so we can do a little bit of debugging and inspection here. And once you've got your logger in place, we'll also right-click on the REST request and add a breakpoint to that REST requester. Great. From here, we'll save up the entire project. And let's run this project in debug mode. If you are asked to save any file that you had not yet saved, like me, you can hit OK. And then the application should attempt to start up in debug mode. All right, once inside of debug mode, let's head back over to Postman. And inside of Postman, we'll make a similar request, but this time hitting our local endpoint. So from Postman, let's go in and put in localhost 8081/United. Hit send, and now it should hit our breakpoint in Studio. So if we return to Anypoint Studio, we now see that our HTTP request is selected. Inside of here, we've got the inbound properties, outbound properties that we're used to. Let's use the stepper here to step forward one on top of the logger. Great. And now inside of here, you can see the HTTP server gave us a 200 OK response, application JSON back, and you can see the payload in this specific case is a buffered input stream, or a buffer input stream rather. Now, a little trick I can show you inside of here is when you're debugging and you have things like streams, sometimes you can put a little expression in that will print it out so you can view it as a string, oftentimes helpful in debugging. So for example, if we go to that little x + y = question mark button we were using earlier, in the expression box with me here, try typing in message.payload_as, and inside of the payload as box, let's put in java.lang.string and hit enter. Now you can select the body of the message and see what actually came back inside of the web service. Now, this will consume the stream and turn it into a string for subsequent message processors. So those of you who have potentially worked a little bit heavier with Java or really understand the concept of streams and consuming and transforming the content of streams to something else, just be aware that, again, you've truly turned it into a string at this point. But for debugging purposes, that might be just fine. All we want to do is see the body of the content here. So with that being said, we'll send it all the way through back to Postman. And if we go back to Postman, we can of course see that the data came back. Even though we called our mule endpoint, it still reached out to that REST web service and returned the JSON body back to us. Now, let's take a look at the structure of this data versus what we're expecting. So if we go back to Anypoint Studio again, inside of source main API, we've got our API YAML file defined inside of here. If we go inside of the API.YAML file and look at the example response, it actually does look a little bit different structurally than what we had in Postman. You'll notice the top especially, it looks a bit different. In Anypoint Studio, if we go to source test resources and open up the flights example JSON, similar idea, we can see in the flights example JSON, there appears to be just this general structure, but in the actual response we're getting back, there is this extra element for flights which holds the array of the various flights. So if we want to match our API spec, it looks like we're going to have to do a little bit of transformation to satisfy it. Let's return to the implementation XML, and between the logger and the REST request, let's go ahead and add in a transform message element or data weave transformer between these two. All right, Now, with data weave in place, let's go ahead and specify an input metadata. That way it knows what our input type is going to look like. So to do this, let's click Define Metadata on the left. Within Define Metadata, we'll add a new metadata line called United_JSON and click Create Type. Once you've clicked Create Type, let's change the type at the top from simple to JSON. The schema is going to be changed to an example, and we'll browse out to our project. Now inside of our project, we want to be inside of source, test, resources once again. And in this case, we're going to get the United Flights example JSON. This will give us a structure, and in this case, you'll see the upper flights element similar to what we were seeing in Postman. Let's now hit select. Great. Now let's define some output metadata so we know what we're transforming into. Let's click Define Metadata. Once again, hit Add. In this type, we are going to call flights_JSON and hit Create Type. The type we'll choose here will also be JSON, and instead of schema, we'll also select example. Browse one more time, and inside of source test resources, we'll choose the flights example.json, specifically the plural flights, and hit open. It should now update with our structure and we can hit select. All right, and now we should be able to begin the mapping process. So we'll begin by mapping some of these fields from the left to the respective ones on the right. So I'll take airline over, price will go to price, departure date will move over to departure date, and plane type to plane type. A little bit lower there. All right. Origin will be the from airport. Similarly, destination will be the to airport. Empty seats mapping over to empty seats, and code, of course, going to flight code. So we can see this structure on the right that it's beginning to write in the data weave language. Great. Now we can save up our application. Once again, if your application was already running from the previous debug session, it should restart now. If it wasn't, no big deal, just be sure to start it in debug mode. We'll now go inside of Postman, and from Postman, we'll make another request in and debug it in Anypoint Studio. Let's step over the HTTP requester. Similar to what we saw before, our payload is the buffer input stream. We'll step one more time over data weave, and with data weave, you'll notice a very specific payload type from the Weave reader package, the byte array seekable stream, so a slightly different data type than what we saw before. If we step forward and send that response back to our client, in our client, we should now see our desired structure, the absence of flight at the top, and just simply an array of JSON objects containing all the different flight information inside of it.